zoom out, I think what's important in this is what China is doing is very strategically putting money in the right pockets and buying off countries around the Pacific, around the world, actually, in opposition to what the people actually want. But this is all being done through Western banking systems. And if the West can crack down on this very easily. And again, that goes back to kind of that congressional staffer level thing. If like people in these countries put pressure on their government, they can put pressure on the Chinese Communist Party. Am I wrong in saying that this is something that could happen?
Oh no, I think it's very, very easy. And you know, if anybody's watching in Australia or New Zealand or anywhere where these banking systems touch, you know, it is your duty. And the Australians have a bunch of excuses. They'll say, you know, we don't want to look like we're interfering in internal politics. Well, if the money is going through the Australian or New Zealand systems, which it is, then it is your duty to the Australian and New Zealand people to make sure that your systems are clean. So that's one thing. The other thing is the other thing that they'll say, the Australians and New Zealanders will say often, the Australians in particular, is we don't want to we don't meet with the opposition, and we don't want to do subnational engagement because we don't want the Chinese dealing with our opposition or dealing with
as they are.
Yeah. Right.
I'm just thinking about Daniel Andrews in charge of Victoria State in Australia, and how basically, even though he was like a local premier at a subnational level, he was heavily influenced by what the CCP wanted to do in that province.
Signed a Belt and Road agreement for that province.
Port of Victoria, I think.
Yeah.
So
they will use, the Australians, I've heard, it happened to me, will use that example to say why they don't want China to be able to do that in their place, and so that's why they're not doing it elsewhere.
So you set up an agreement with the CCP that, if you don't interfere with us at this level, then we won't interfere with you, and then we hold ourselves to this agreement on our side, but they obviously don't hold themselves to an agreement.
I mean,
right?
I don't think that there's even an agreement.
Well, there's not. I'm just saying that like there's no world in which
if we play nice, then China will too.
There we go. There's no world in which that is the actual reality.
And why not just apply reciprocity rules? Say, okay, you know, China can't do us at a subnational level because we can't do it in China, right? But it's not like Australia isn't engaging with Texas for investment or whatever. And it's not like they're sitting in Washington and only talking to Democrats when the Democrats are in power, not talking to Republicans. It's, you know, if you're a democracy, you engage differently. So it's a kind of it's a convenient excuse that doesn't stand up to logical interrogation. And
it does stand up to all the Chinese money in Australia, though.
Well, you may say so, but I couldn't possibly comment. You know, so there's that problem, and then there's the problem of Australian and New Zealand media and academia. You know, there's when this article first we wrote about that. I wrote a piece with Grant Newsham that was looking at this, and if you haven't heard about what's going on in the Solomon Islands, it's in part because there's very little coverage, and when the election did happen, what coverage there was focused mostly on the fact that Sogavare wasn't prime minister. But we knew that he would probably end up in the cabinet, and we knew that the fight wasn't over because you're waiting to see what would happen in the provinces. But there was that flurry of initial coverage. And this goes to how good the CCP is at understanding our systems and manipulating our systems. And you're getting articles like Australia breathes a sigh of relief as Sogavare steps aside as prime minister, without follow-up coverage on a lot of this other stuff.
Yeah, I feel like we were a little guilty of that too, because we covered the initial elections fairly in depth, but
which seemed more optimistic.
Which seemed more optimistic at the time, and then we did a follow up, like briefly, about Sogavare becoming finance minister, but we haven't looked at what happened provincially since then.
Yeah.
Well-
Well, I mean, we had Cleo on
Mhm.
right
Good.
now.
Good thing you're not regaling the audience with 15 hours of domestic Solomon Islands politics at the moment. But to be fair, if I can quote a famous Canadian television show, we didn't really know what the outcome would be until this past week when we finally had the Malaita outcome for premier. So now we can step back and take a look at this whole picture of what happened. And what happened is, I would argue, the worst possible outcome, because this boogeyman of Sugavari is not as visible. You've got a much more polished politician leading Solomon Islands. He is known not. He's pro Cuba, pro China, but he'll say a lot of things in a way that will allow people to discount the threat. And Sudani's out. That disqualification case where they took away his seat for having not recognized the One China policy, that's still pending in the Supreme Court. So I think that's going to be heard. The final thing is going to be, or the next phase is going to be in June. So there is still the potential for him to be disqualified. And at that point, it will be a test to see how compromised the judiciary has become in Solomon Islands. So I think it's very much worth taking a look at this entire procedure of what happened in Solomon's. I think the Chinese thought they didn't have enough in place to have the election when it was supposed to be held last year, which was one of the reasons why they bought off enough people in the parliament to delay the elections by a year by changing the constitution. And they knew that the West would mostly be looking at election day. So the election observers can go home and say, it was mostly free and fair. There were no problems at the election box, at the voting booths. But then you steal it when nobody's really paying much attention anymore. And I think I'm extremely concerned. I think that the other Huawei towers are going to go in. They're talking about putting in an international port in Malaita. There's the words that you never want to hear coming out of a prime minister mouth. One of the first things that the new prime minister announced was that they were looking at legislation setting up special economic zones in Solomon Islands. This is going in a really dangerous direction, and there's just no help. Like if you are a representative of a district in Malaita and you've got no health care, your expectant mothers have to walk over terrible roads for kilometers and kilometers to get to a clinic to give birth. And they may or may not have medicine in the clinic. Your school system is in terrible shape. There are no jobs for your young people. And you're sitting there deciding which premier you're going to support. And one side says, we'll give you all sorts of development projects from the national government, from the Chinese, from the Australians, from the Americans, that's us. And the other side is saying, don't sell your soul. We can't promise you anything except democracy and freedom. What are you supposed to do?